The sirens blared, piercing the silence of the Phoenix night as I sped through the streets, my grip tight on the wheel. I had waited too long for this moment. Every instinct, every fiber of my being was honed in on the figure up ahead, a shadow dodging between alleys, cutting across the empty parking lots. This was my guy, the same slippery bastard I'd been chasing for over a year. But tonight, there would be no escape. Adrenaline thrummed through me, and I felt a familiar, almost comforting determination settle in my chest. This wasn't just another routine, this was personal. Damn it, I muttered under my breath, watching as he darted down yet another side street, disappearing from view. He was fast, too fast, his silhouette slipping out of my headlights like smoke, and that's when it happened. He was gone. Just like that. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, frustration boiling over. One damn minute, one small slip up, and he was gone, blending into the shadows of the city like he always did. I sat there, engine idling, hands shaking with a strange mix of rage and helplessness. I'd been through this before, but tonight it felt different, worse. I drove home in silence, the weight of defeat hanging over me like a storm cloud. Karen's car was in the driveway when I pulled up, her headlights casting long shadows across the house. I hadn't expected her to be home this late, but then again, nothing about her habits felt familiar lately. Ever since she'd started working late a few months back, things between us had changed. Subtle at first, like the faint smell of smoke before a fire. I stepped into the quiet of the house, my footsteps echoing as I walked down the hallway. Karen was in the kitchen, sitting at the table, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I entered, and for a second I thought I saw guilt flicker in her eyes before it vanished, replaced by her usual calm, unreadable expression. "Late night?" she asked, her voice smooth and almost detached. "Yeah," I replied shortly, shrugging off my jacket. "Just missed a lead." She nodded, taking another sip of her wine, her gaze drifting back down to the table. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable, until she finally stood up and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me standing alone. Something in her eyes haunted me, a glimmer of something hidden, something she didn't want me to see. The house was quiet, and yet somehow it felt suffocating. I poured myself a drink, downing it in one go. Then I noticed her phone on the counter. She'd left it unlocked. I stared at it, knowing I shouldn't, but something, call it instinct, call it suspicion, made me reach out and take it in my hand. The messages were there, plain as day, threads upon threads of conversations, each one more damning than the last. Words exchanged in secret, promises and confessions of a kind that made my stomach turn. And at the top of the list, his name, like a brand, like a curse. Aaron, my goddamn fugitive. I stood there, staring down at the screen, the words blurring as a wave of disbelief and anger washed over me. My wife, Karen, was cheating on me, with him. The man I'd been trying to catch, the one who had slipped through my fingers so many times. It was as if the universe was laughing at me, pointing and jeering while I stood there, blindsided by the harshness of it all. But in that moment, the anger cooled, and a plan began to form, clear and ruthless. I would make sure he paid for everything he'd done, both as a criminal and as a man who dared to take what was mine. And as for Karen, she would finally see the consequences of betraying me. I placed her phone back on the counter, left the kitchen, and walked out onto the front porch. The cool night air hit me like a slap, calming me and steadying me. This was far from over. It was only just beginning. Days went by in a slow-motion haze, each one blending into the next. At work, I kept my head down, playing the part of the tired cop with too many cases piling up. My colleagues noticed I was more distant and more withdrawn, but they chalked it up to the frustration of another botched pursuit. No one knew what was really driving me. By night, I went home to Karen's indifferent silence. We hardly spoke. Every time she glanced at me, I could sense her guilt, buried under layers of lies. But she wasn't ready to admit anything, and I wasn't about to let on that I knew. This time, I would play my cards right. The real work started the night I sat down at my desk and pulled out Aaron's file. I read through every detail, each line giving me something new to work with. Fraud, theft, assault. Aaron had left behind a trail of misery and ruined lives. Yet he had managed to slip through the cracks of the system each time, vanishing before we could pin him down. And now, here he was, tangled up in my life, ruining everything I had built. It was almost poetic how easy it would be to turn the tables. I began by collecting pieces, small things I knew would fit together to create a picture so damning, no court in the state would question it. There were open cases connected to recent thefts in Phoenix, high-end electronics, car parts, and luxury goods stolen from local warehouses. Evidence had been sparse, but I had access to all of it. It didn't take much to move things around, adjust a few names and add a witness statement here, and a CCTV frame there. By the end of the week, I had him tied to enough charges to put him away for years. But I needed more than the paperwork. I needed to make sure he would be in the right place at the right time. And that was where Karen came in. She barely noticed as I made small changes to her routine. On a quiet Thursday morning, she mentioned she'd be working late again that night. I nodded, keeping my face neutral, careful not to give away anything. I knew exactly where she was going, and now, so would he. "Don't wait up," she said, her eyes flicking to the door, her voice full of the usual distance. "Sure," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Take all the time you need." As soon as she was gone, I set my plan in motion. I called in a favor, one that was delicate and dangerous but necessary. I needed backup, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Just one officer from another precinct, a guy I'd worked with before, someone who could be trusted to stay quiet. He didn't need to know why, he just needed to show up. When I arrived at the spot later that evening, I waited, hidden in the shadows, every nerve in my body electric with anticipation. I knew Aaron would be there. Karen had messaged him, confirming the time and place. It was an abandoned lot on the edge of town, one of those places where no one would notice a quick meeting in the dead of night. I watched her pull up, stepping out of her car in that dress she only wore for him. She checked her phone, looking around as if she was afraid someone might see her. Minutes later, Aaron showed up, swaggering out of his car like he owned the place. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their bodies leaned close, her face tilting up to meet his. They stood there, laughing and whispering, the sight burning itself into my memory, stoking the anger I had been bottling up. That's when I made my move. My partner for the night was ready, waiting by the edge of the lot, his hand on his weapon, his face hidden in the shadows. I signaled to him with a small nod, and we stepped into the open, guns drawn. "Aaron Sanders," I called out, my voice steady, betraying nothing of the satisfaction twisting inside me. Hands in the air, Karen's head whipped around, her eyes going wide as she saw me. I could see the shock, the betrayal etched into her face as her gaze darted from me to Aaron. He raised his hands slowly, his face hardening, realizing he was trapped. "This is entrapment," he sneered, trying to keep his cool. "You got nothing on me." "Oh, I've got plenty on you," I replied, taking a step closer. "The thefts, the assault. We've got you tied to it all." He tried to talk his way out, throwing insults, but it didn't matter. The evidence was all there, carefully constructed, and he wouldn't escape this time. My partner stepped forward, cuffing him, and led him to the car. As they pulled away, I turned to Karen, her face pale and her body shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "Jake," she stammered, reaching out, her voice cracking. "Please, it's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I replied coldly, feeling a strange satisfaction as the words cut through the air. "He's out of your life now. You got what you wanted, didn't you?" She didn't answer. There were no more lies left to hide behind, no more stolen moments in the shadows. All that was left was the emptiness of betrayal. I didn't wait for her to respond. I left her standing there, her hands still reaching out, the reality of her choices crashing down on her. I walked away, my mind already focusing on the next step, on what I would need to do to finally close this chapter and leave everything and everyone behind. The arrest was all over the precinct by the following morning. Aaron Sanders, one of Phoenix's most elusive criminals, was finally behind bars. The chief even called me in to congratulate me, saying it was one of the cleanest takedowns he'd seen in years. I thanked him, giving nothing away, playing my part as the worn-out officer who'd finally scored a big win. But inside, I felt hollow. There was no real satisfaction. I'd pictured this moment for so long, the cheers, the pats on the back, the rush of pride. Yet now, none of it mattered. I knew that the true crime I was punishing wasn't Aaron's string of robberies or assault charges. It was something far more personal. Back home, Karen tried to reach out to me. She was everywhere, hovering in doorways, lingering in the kitchen, acting as if things could be patched over with a few soft words. But I barely looked at her. When I did, I saw only the lies, every one of them sharpened to a fine point. There was no trust left to salvage. "Jake," she said one evening, her voice trembling, "can we talk about this? Just give me a chance to explain." I put down the glass I was holding and looked at her, my expression unreadable. "Explain what? The fact that you betrayed me? Or that you thought you'd get away with it?" She faltered, her eyes glistening with tears, but her silence only hardened me further. I wanted her to understand what she had done, to feel every ounce of pain she'd caused me. I didn't care if she cried. I didn't care if she felt regret. All I cared about was that she could never undo what she'd destroyed. For days, we barely spoke. I kept to my routines, went to work, and did my job. Each day felt like I was just going through the motions, my energy drained by a hollow sense of duty. But deep down, I knew that things couldn't continue like this. My plan had gone perfectly, but the consequences were eating me alive. One night, I found myself driving without a destination, the Phoenix skyline disappearing in the rearview mirror. The air was warm and dry, the kind of Arizona heat that felt suffocating, even late at night. I ended up on the outskirts of town, in a quiet desert spot where the city lights barely touched. I sat there, the silence pressing in, the vast emptiness around me mirroring how I felt inside. Memories flooded back, moments with Karen from before everything went wrong. The small, quiet dinners, the weekends spent at the lake, the inside jokes we shared. Each memory was like a dagger, cutting deeper than anything she or Aaron could have done. I realized I wasn't just angry at her. I was mourning the life we'd once had, the life that would never be the same. The next morning, I made my decision. The precinct buzzed with its usual morning rush, but for me, it was the last time I'd be part of it. I walked into the chief's office and handed over my resignation. He looked stunned, asking if I was sure if this was really what I wanted. "I need a clean slate," I told him, keeping my voice steady. "A chance to start over." He nodded, though I could see the disappointment in his eyes. I had been one of his most reliable guys, the one he could always count on. But that life was over, and I knew it. Back home, I packed a bag. Karen watched me, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. "Jake, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't do this. We can fix this. Whatever it takes, I'll do it. I'll make it right." I turned to her, looking into those eyes that once held so much love and warmth. Now all I saw was regret. Too little, too late. "You broke us, Karen," I said quietly, my voice as cold as I felt inside. "There's nothing left to fix." She sank to her knees, sobbing, but I didn't stay to watch. I picked up my bag, walked out of the door, and didn't look back. The road stretched out before me, endless and unknown, the beginning of a new life. But as I drove away from everything I'd ever known, the sense of freedom I'd expected didn't come. Instead, a gnawing emptiness settled in my chest, the knowledge that some wounds never truly heal. No matter how far I drove, I couldn't outrun what had happened. The betrayal would haunt me, shaping the man I would become, a reminder of the life I had lost. I was free, but in a way I had never anticipated, cut off, adrift, and alone. Starting over wasn't as easy as I thought. Phoenix was hundreds of miles behind me, a city of memories I wanted to bury, but it clung to me in ways I couldn't escape. Days blurred together in the new town, the flat plains stretching endlessly around me, a quiet and empty backdrop. I took odd jobs here and there, anything to keep me busy and keep my mind from drifting back to Karen and everything I had lost. But in the silence of each new night, the memories would resurface. I avoided any connection that might tie me to my old life, kept to myself, and went by a different last name. People here didn't know who I was or what I had been through. They knew nothing of the betrayal, the pain, or the quiet rage that had carved itself into me. I was just another face in the crowd. But even anonymity had its limits. One night, I was at a bar on the edge of town. The place was old, filled with locals and drifters like me, people who came here to escape. The faint smell of whiskey and stale smoke clung to the air. I sat at the far end of the bar, nursing a drink, my back to the door. As the night dragged on, I felt someone slide into the seat beside me. I didn't look up, but a familiar voice cut through the haze around me. Jake. It was a voice I knew all too well. Slowly, I turned, and there she was. Karen. She looked thinner, her face drawn with a kind of brokenness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I could tell she hadn't been sleeping. She looked like a ghost of the woman I once knew, and I didn't feel pity, only the reminder of what she had done. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. She swallowed, her hands trembling slightly. "I needed to find you," I had to explain. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh even to my own ears. "You think there's something left to explain?" She looked down, gripping her hands tightly as if she were holding herself together by sheer force. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Jake, but I needed to see you, to try and make things right." I took a long sip of my drink, looking past her to the bar and to the strangers who filled the room. Her words barely registered, they sounded hollow, like an echo of the promises she'd broken. "Nothing can make this right, Karen. You and I, we're done. I left for a reason." I turned back to her, and for the first time, I saw her eyes flash with something, a glimmer of anger or maybe desperation. "I know that," she said, her voice unsteady. "But I can't live with what I did. I see it every day, Jake. Every time I look in the mirror, I see the mistake I made, and it's eating me alive." I wanted to tell her that it didn't matter, that her guilt wouldn't erase the past. But instead, I found myself caught between anger and a strange, unfamiliar sense of finality. There was nothing more to say, but there was also no satisfaction in seeing her broken. It didn't undo the scars. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I heard what happened to Aaron, too. He's in prison. I know that was you." I shrugged. "Maybe, but it's over now. Whatever I did, it was a part of letting go." She looked at me, her eyes searching, as if she were trying to find some hint of the man I used to be. But I wasn't that man anymore. Her betrayal had changed me in ways I hadn't understood until now. "Goodbye, Karen," I said quietly, not waiting for her response. I left her there, surrounded by strangers, the memories of our life together fading with each step. Leaving Karen at that bar felt like closure, but it was a fragile kind, like a door I closed only to realize it wasn't locked. In the following days, her visit lingered in my mind like smoke that wouldn't clear, settling in every corner of my thoughts. I knew I had left Phoenix and everything attached to it behind for a reason, but facing her again had stirred up everything I tried to bury: resentment, regret, and the loss that haunted me every night. I tried to shake it off, throwing myself deeper into work. I'd picked up a job at a local mechanic shop, nothing glamorous, just steady hours and heavy lifting to keep my hands busy and my mind numb. I got up, went to work, went home, and repeated the cycle. But no matter how hard I tried, my memories of Karen and what we once had continued to seep into my days. Even in this new life, in a new town, my past was everywhere, hovering like a ghost. One evening, as I was closing up the shop, my boss, Hank, an old-timer with a quick laugh and a story for everything, asked me to grab a drink. I'd spent the last few months keeping to myself, brushing off social invitations, but that night, I figured, why not? Maybe a drink would dull the ache for a few hours. Over a couple of beers, Hank talked about his days working in the mines, about his kids and grandkids, about his wife who had passed a few years back. It was strange, sitting there with a man who'd gone through real losses, the kind of scars time couldn't heal. And then, unexpectedly, he asked, "What about you, Jake? What brought you out here?" I could have lied, but something in Hank's honest eyes made me tell the truth, at least some version of it. Left Phoenix, needed a fresh start. He nodded, a knowing look crossing his face. Fresh starts are rare, you know. People think they're like flipping a switch. But real clean slates? He shook his head. They take work, son. Real hard work. I looked down, the beer turning sour in my mouth. Hank didn't know the details, but his words cut deep. Maybe he was right. Maybe I'd thought I could run from everything. But in reality, I was still dragging my past along like a chain. That night, after Hank's words had settled into me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my apartment. The blank walls, the emptiness of the room, everything reminded me of what I'd lost. As much as I hated it, I had to face the truth. My life was fractured, and it was because I had spent months running from the past instead of accepting it. In the morning, I woke with a purpose, a clarity that I hadn't felt in ages. It was time to stop hiding from the scars Karen had left. I went back to the bar where I'd seen her, hoping in some twisted way that she might still be around. But there was nothing there, just the hollow memory of our encounter. So instead, I drove out to the desert, a place just outside the town where the sand stretched endlessly under the clear blue sky. I parked the car and stood there, staring out at the vast, empty landscape. I thought about everything that had brought me to this point. The love I'd given Karen, the betrayal that had shattered us, and the revenge that hadn't healed anything. Standing there, I finally allowed myself to feel it all. The anger, the hurt, the emptiness, all of it washed over me like a storm. I didn't hold back. I let myself yell into the open air, venting all the emotions I'd bottled up for so long. And when I was done, there was a strange calm. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something. Back in town, I knew what I needed to do. The ghosts of my past weren't going to disappear on their own, but maybe I could make peace with them, one small step at a time. After my outburst in the desert, something shifted in me. The weight of everything I'd held onto began to lighten, just enough that I could see a way forward. I couldn't change the past, but I could decide how much power it would hold over me. For the first time in months, I let myself consider the possibility of rebuilding, not just a new life, but myself. Back at work, Hank noticed the change. I was more present and more engaged. Instead of shrinking into the shadows, I put myself into the rhythm of each day, learning everything I could about the trade. I'd never thought of myself as a mechanic, but working with my hands and fixing broken parts became almost therapeutic. It was like I was learning to fix myself, one small repair at a time. One evening after work, Hank called me over. "You know, Jake, you're good at this," he said, handing me a cold beer. "Got a knack for fixing things up, even the real damaged ones." I took a sip, nodding, but his words sank deeper than he knew. Fixing up damaged things, I suppose that was all I'd been doing since I left Phoenix. Hank had become like a mentor to me, giving me the stability I hadn't even realized I was craving. And for the first time in a long while, I could picture a future that wasn't weighed down by my past. But healing doesn't happen in a straight line. That night, I came home to a message on my phone. It was Karen. Her voice was soft, tired. She'd found my number somehow. "Jake," she said, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I needed you to know I'm trying too. Trying to make sense of it all, even if it's too late for us. I hope you're okay." Hearing her voice reopened the wounds. I thought I'd moved past it, but she still had a hold on me somewhere deep down. Her words lingered in my mind, stirring a mixture of anger, sadness, and a strange sense of relief. She was finally facing her own demons, but it wasn't my job to fix her anymore. The days that followed felt like a test. Karen's message echoed in my head, distracting me from the steps I'd been taking to rebuild. Part of me wanted to call her back, to finally hear the words I thought would give me closure. But I knew that wouldn't bring the peace I was searching for. One night, Hank invited me over to his house for dinner. He and his family had become the closest thing I had to friends in this new life, and I found comfort in their warmth and normalcy. Over dinner, Hank's wife asked about my life before I came to town. I told them a bit, leaving out the details, of course. But talking about the move and the new beginning reminded me of why I'd left in the first place. Afterward, Hank pulled me aside. "Sometimes you just have to let the past stay in the past, Jake. There's no going back to what's broken." Those words struck a chord, and I knew it was time. When I got home, I stared at my phone. Karen's number was still saved there from that message. With a deep breath, I hit delete. It felt like closing a door that had been hanging open for far too long. The pain of our past was still there, but the grip it had on me had finally loosened. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The memories didn't haunt me as they usually did. Instead, I dreamt of the open desert, of endless roads stretching out before me, paths to places I hadn't yet seen. For the first time, I wasn't looking back. I was looking forward. With Karen's number erased and the weight of her memory beginning to fade, I felt a freedom I hadn't thought possible. Days turned into weeks, and in each one, I found myself growing stronger. My work at the shop became more than just a job. It was a routine that kept me grounded. each repair serving as a reminder that things, no matter how broken, could be fixed. One morning, Hank called me into his office. He told me that he'd been thinking of retiring soon and wanted me to consider taking over the shop. The offer was a shock. I'd always seen this town and my work here as temporary, a stopover. But Hank's offer felt like an opportunity, a chance to make something my own. I went home that night and thought long and hard. Owning the shop would mean putting down roots and committing to a new beginning. It would mean fully letting go of Phoenix, of Karen, of everything I'd left behind. It scared me, but for the first time, that fear felt like something I wanted to face. The next morning, I went back to Hank with my answer. "I'll do it," I said, a mixture of anxiety and excitement coursing through me. Hank just gave me one of his knowing grins and clapped me on the shoulder. And with that decision, something in me solidified. I wasn't just running from the past anymore. I was building something new. I was giving myself permission to find happiness again, in my own way. In the weeks following my decision to take over the shop, life began to settle into a steady rhythm. The people in town knew my face now, greeting me with familiarity. It felt strange at first, the idea of belonging somewhere again, but I let myself lean into it. My past was still there, a faint shadow, but I was no longer haunted by it. One day, as I was closing up shop, a woman walked in. She was about my age, with an easy smile and a warmth that felt genuine. Her name was Claire, a teacher at the local school. Her car had broken down on the edge of town, and she'd heard I was the guy to fix it. As we talked, I realized it had been a long time since I'd felt comfortable around someone new. There was something about Claire's presence that put me at ease. She didn't ask about my past or pry into why I'd ended up here. Instead, we talked about the town, her students, and life's little surprises. She laughed easily, and something about her laugh made me want to hear it again. After fixing her car, she thanked me with a shy smile, asking if I'd like to get a coffee sometime. I found myself saying yes, even though the idea of dating again had been the last thing on my mind. But Claire wasn't tied to my past. She was part of the present, a sign of everything I could gain if I allowed myself to move forward. As I watched her drive away, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. The scars were still there, reminders of what I'd been through, but they no longer defined me. My life was no longer just about what I'd lost. It was about what I could still build, the people I could still meet, and the places I could still go. And so, with the open road behind me and a new beginning in front, I felt ready. Ready to embrace the future, to let go of the ghost that had once ruled my life. I was finally free. Taking over Hank's shop became more than just a job. It was my way of rebuilding. Each repair, every handshake with a new customer, it felt like I was patching up my life, bit by bit. Claire and I started meeting for coffee more often, her easy laugh and kind eyes a steadying presence I hadn't realized I needed. One night, she invited me to a small get-together with her friends. I hadn't been part of a gathering like that since Phoenix, and it felt strange at first. But soon, her friends' genuine kindness and easygoing nature made me feel comfortable and welcome even. I realized that I'd finally found something I'd been missing for so long, a sense of community, a place where I could just be Jake, without the weight of my past bearing down on me. That evening, after everyone else had left, Claire and I sat on her porch, wrapped in the cool night air and the quiet hum of the neighborhood. She looked over at me, her gaze gentle yet steady. "You've been through something, haven't you?" she asked softly, not prying but simply acknowledging the scars she must have sensed beneath the surface. I hesitated, but for the first time I felt the urge to let someone in. So I told her about Karen, the betrayal, the revenge, and the emptiness that had swallowed me whole afterward. I expected judgment or pity, but instead, Claire just nodded, her hand covering mine. "We all carry our past, Jake," she whispered, "but you're here now. That's what matters." As I drove home that night, I felt something new, hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could finally leave the past where it belonged and build something real in its place. In the months that followed, life settled into a new kind of normal. Claire and I grew closer, her warmth and resilience a steadying force in my life. The shop flourished under my care, and the town, once a quiet escape, had become home. For the first time, I found myself looking forward instead of back. But life has a way of testing you, even when you think you've moved on. One afternoon, I received a letter from Phoenix. It was from Karen. The sight of her handwriting stirred up memories I thought were long buried. With a deep breath, I sat down and opened the envelope, bracing myself for whatever she had to say. In the letter, Karen wrote of regret, of sleepless nights haunted by what she'd done. She admitted her mistakes, acknowledged the pain she'd caused, and even apologized. But the letter wasn't an attempt to win me back. It was a closure of her own. She wished me well, hoped I'd found peace, and wrote that she was working on rebuilding her own life, one step at a time. Reading her words, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief in finally having that chapter closed, but also a sadness for what we'd lost and the way things had ended. I'd spent so long letting that betrayal define me, shaping every choice, every fear. But now, holding her letter in my hands, I realized that her hold over me was finally broken. That night, I took the letter out to the desert, letting the warm evening wind carry away the last pieces of that life. I watched as the paper burned and the embers floated into the night, feeling lighter than I ever had before. Returning to town, I found Claire waiting for me. I didn't say anything, just took her hand, letting her warmth steady me. And as we walked together under the open sky, I knew that I was finally free, not just from Karen's betrayal, but from the ghosts of the life I'd left behind. In that quiet moment, I understood that my journey wasn't about revenge or escape. It was about healing, about letting go. And for the first time, I felt whole, ready to embrace whatever life had in store. Life after letting go of Karen's letter felt different, as though an invisible weight had finally lifted. Each day was now just a day, not a reminder of what had once been or what I'd lost. And with each passing week, the town became more like home, and Claire more like the future I wanted. One Friday evening, Claire and I took a drive into the mountains outside town, a spot she loved with views of the vast desert stretching for miles. We sat on the hood of my truck, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky a blend of orange and purple. "This place," Claire said, gazing out over the landscape, "it has a way of healing people." I nodded, understanding what she meant. I hadn't expected to find peace here in this small town, but it had given me exactly that. The town, the shop, and Claire, they were pieces of a life I never thought I'd have again. A life is free of bitterness, rooted in something real. As the stars began to emerge, she turned to me. Her expression softened. "Jake," she said quietly, "do you think you'll ever go back to Phoenix?" The question hung in the air, but I knew my answer. "No," I said, feeling the truth of it in my bones. Phoenix, that was a different life. I've moved on. This, I gestured to the wide open sky above us, the world Claire and I had built together. This is my home now. She reached for my hand, her fingers warm against mine. In that simple gesture, I felt everything I'd been searching for since leaving Phoenix. Belonging, purpose, and something I hadn't allowed myself to believe in for a long time, love. Looking into Claire's eyes, I realized that my journey wasn't just about escaping my past. It was about finding my way back to myself. And sitting there, with her by my side in the vast desert stretching out before us, I knew I'd finally arrived. My old life, the pain and the betrayal, it was all behind me now. For the first time, I was free to look forward, to build something lasting. This new chapter of my life wasn't defined by what I'd lost, but by what I'd found. And as we sat under the night sky, I knew I'd found exactly where I was meant to be. In the days following that night with Claire in the mountains, I felt a kind of contentment I hadn't known in years. The shop was busier than ever, the familiar rhythm of work grounding me in ways I hadn't expected. It felt good to have something of my own, to be known around town as Jake, the mechanic, not as a cop with baggage. One afternoon, Hank came by the shop. He walked in with his usual grin, but seemed quieter, almost hesitant. After a moment, he asked if he could have a word, so I put down my tools, curious. "You've made something good here, Jake," he started, looking around the shop with pride. "People respect you, they trust you. That's hard to come by." I nodded, not entirely sure where he was going with this. Then he continued, "I'm thinking of fully stepping away, and I want you to take over the shop entirely. Make it your own. I'm not just talking about running it, I'm talking about buying it, signing the papers, making it official." The offer took me by surprise. I'd never expected this place, this work, to become my future. But when I looked around, I realized it already had. The dusty old shop felt like home, like something worth investing in, and Hank's trust in me was something I wouldn't take lightly. After a long pause, I met his gaze. "I'd be honored, Hank. Really, thank you." He clapped me on the shoulder, his familiar grin returning. "You earned it, son." That night, I told Claire over dinner. Her eyes lit up, her smile wide. She raised her glass, and we toasted to new beginnings, the past finally a distant memory. As the months went by, the shop truly became mine. I made some changes here and there, added a few personal touches, and hired another mechanic to keep up with the demand. The work was steady, honest, and fulfilling in ways I couldn't have anticipated back in Phoenix. One afternoon, Claire came by the shop with a picnic basket, a mischievous grin on her face. "Thought you could use a break," she teased, setting the basket down on the hood of a car. We sat there in the sun, eating sandwiches and talking about everything and nothing, just enjoying each other's company. At one point, she looked at me, her gaze thoughtful. "You know, you seem different, happier." And she was right. The pain that had once driven me, the bitterness and anger, they'd faded into something quieter, softer. I wasn't running anymore. I was here, fully present, and content in a way that I'd once thought was impossible. As the sun began to set, I looked around at everything I'd built, the life I'd carved out of the rubble of my past. Claire squeezed my hand, her warmth grounding me, reminding me of the strength it had taken to get here. This place, this woman by my side, and the peace that had come with finally letting go, it was more than I'd ever dared hope for. And for the first time, I felt ready, truly ready, to embrace the life in front of me, leaving the shadows of my past firmly behind. In that moment, I knew that my journey was no longer about running from what was but embracing everything that could be. And as I looked out over the town that had become my sanctuary, I understood that I'd finally found my home. Months passed in a steady rhythm, each day rooted in a routine yet laced with the small joys that had begun to color my life. The shop was thriving, my friendships in the community deepening, and my relationship with Claire growing stronger. The life I'd rebuilt was no longer just a refuge from the past. It was becoming a real future. One quiet evening, Claire and I took a walk through town. The sky was a fading wash of blue and gold, the air warm and familiar. As we strolled past storefronts, her hand in mine, I found myself thinking back to everything that had led me here. I'd come to this town as a broken man, weighed down by betrayal and anger, but somehow, piece by piece, I'd let that all go. We stopped at the edge of the town park, and Claire sat down on a bench, her eyes fixed on the children playing nearby. She looked at me, a question lingering in her expression. "What's next for you, Jake?" she asked softly. It was a question I'd spent so long avoiding, focused instead on healing from my past. But now, with her by my side, I felt ready to answer it. "I want to stay," I said, meeting her gaze. "I want to build a life here, with you." Her smile in response was soft, filled with a warmth that felt like home. We talked for hours that evening, not about the past but about the future, dreams, plans, the small and large hopes we had for ourselves and each other. In the days that followed, I began to take steps to make that future real. I invested more in the shop, thinking about ways to expand and even hire more help. Claire and I talked about a place of our own, a home we could build together, where we'd be free from the shadows of our past lives. And on one special evening, as we watched the sunset from the mountains, I turned to her, holding her hand tightly. "Claire," I began, my voice steady with the certainty I felt, "I want to make this official. I want you in my life today and every day after." Her answer was a quiet, joyful yes, and we sat there, our hands intertwined, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky filled with stars. It felt like a promise, a beginning, not just for me but for us. Looking back, I knew that my journey had been one of pain and loss, but it had also been one of redemption and renewal. I'd lost everything I thought mattered, only to find something even greater, something real. And as I sat beside Claire in the town that had become my home, I understood that my life was no longer defined by what I'd left behind, but by what lay ahead. This was the future I'd fought for, the one I'd finally allowed myself to embrace. And for the first time, I felt truly whole, ready to step forward, hand in hand with Claire, into whatever the future had in store.